Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Propagandists Playbook: How Conservative Elites Manipulate Search and Threaten Democracy, by Francesca Bolla Tripodi. Narrated by Francesca Bolla Tripodi. To the information seekers everywhere, be mindful where the journey leads. Preface. In 2017, when I began this ethnographic project, I wanted to understand how conservative voters sought out information they felt they could trust. My goal was to better understand how Trump voters made sense of the contemporary news environment, and how search engine optimization might play a role. I had no intention of studying extremism. I had no idea that the way information was tagged and categorized would take me into a media ecosystem fueled by conspiratorial logic. I did not expect the content in which I immersed myself to influence my own mindset, and I certainly did not expect to witness the violence of the Unite the Right rally. Quite frankly, I did not realize how bad it already was, how bad it could get, and how vulnerable we all are, myself included. As a sociologist and media scholar, I apply social theory to my empirical research on how communities interact with algorithmic systems in everyday life. Because even if we don't think we're engaging with data-driven systems, we are, frequently, and in often surprising ways. It is important to be savvy about how technology influences our decision-making at both the macro level, for example, as we collectively shape our policies and culture, and at the micro level, such as when we vote or shop. The interplay between these technical and social realms influences how communities make sense of themselves and the surrounding world. It also molds how we engage with and determine the American democratic process. I started my study by seeking out what the U.S. Census Bureau calls urbanized city centers, those averaging between 50,000 and 100,000 residents. These cities were growing rapidly, which meant a lot of construction, new roads, new schools, and new housing. But while these cities were bustling, they were also homogeneous and isolated. Along the outskirts of each city were mostly rolling hills, fast food restaurants, and gas stations off highway exits. Beyond that, miles of rural roads. The two cities I found look similar in many ways. Both have a small downtown with walkable streets lined with mom-and-pop shops and local restaurants. Just a few blocks outside of this main street are larger roads lined with super chains like Applebee's, Panera Bread, Barnes & Noble, and Walmart. And after that, 2-lane interstates and wide open space. In one city, I conducted ethnographic observations of a college Republican group, and in the other city, a women's Republican group. All names and locations have been changed to protect the identity of those who participated in this study. In addition to participant observation, I conducted interviews and focus groups with 30 individuals, 14 men and 16 women, ranging in age from 18 to 70. These people were either members or affiliates of the groups I observed, or people I met at related events. Interviews lasted approximately 1 hour and were transcribed by a professional service. I centered my observations around the 2017 Virginia gubernatorial race. In the 8 months between June 2017 and February 2018, I attended regular group meetings, fundraisers, rallies, tabling events, city council sessions, debate watching parties, call center events devoted to bolstering voter turnout, backyard barbecues, Bible study sessions, church services, and an election night gathering. I also went to events that were not directly connected to the groups I observed, including a rally for a Republican candidate during the gubernatorial primary and a winner's breakfast hosted by the Republican Party of Virginia after the primary election. Given the prominent debates over Confederate statues during this election, I took a tour of the Confederate Memorial Chapel and conducted participant observations at 3 rallies that were not associated with the groups I observed. The access I gained at these events was predicated on my whiteness. I am a white, cisgender, heterosexual woman and a native-born citizen of the United States. I was already familiar with the Christian rituals conducted at the meetings and events I attended. Nearly every self-identified conservative I interacted with in this study was a white, cisgender, heterosexual Protestant, and a native-born U.S. citizen. To gain access to and cultivate trust with respondents, qualitative researchers engage in significant invisible labor. I realized very quickly that if I wanted Trump voters to trust me and share what news they believed, I needed to project a more conservative persona. I went by Fran or Franny instead of Francesca to avoid any difficulty with pronouncing my name. I bought a few outfits that projected a more modest look, capri pants in solid colors and cardigans over boat neck blouses. I wore flats, a pearl necklace, and matching pearl studs. I put my hair up and wore more makeup than I'm accustomed to wearing. Recognizing the cultural signs associated with purchasing decisions, I regularly arrived at meetings with a large diet soda in a Chick-fil-A cup rather than a Starbucks coffee when I needed to stay awake during long drives afterward. Even though I projected these outward markers, I informed everyone I spoke with that I was a sociology professor, and I was honest about my blue voting record when asked. The goal of my research was to allow conservatives to speak for themselves and identify the kinds of news and information they trusted. Other scholars have pointed out, quite insightfully, that conservatives are not passive recipients of the powerful media apparatus, or what ethnomethodologist Harold Garfinkel would refer to as cultural dopes. Instead, they are actively engaging in deliberate intellectual exploration. It is therefore critical to research how audiences interact with the media in their search for trusted information. The impact of media in everyday life has been a rich area of study for decades. In the 1950s, in response to the direct effect model of communication, sociologists Elihu Katz and Paul Lazarsfeld, through a series of studies, showed that the medium itself plays a minimal role in changing audience reactions. Instead, messages go through a 2-step flow, whereby influencers mediate content. In the 1970s, a cohort at the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies in Birmingham, England, founded a new approach to studying media that shifted scholarly thinking about audiences from a scientific paradigm that treated and measured exposures and effects to one that recognized agency and cultural contexts. Their seminal work pushed back on the traditional assumption that there is only one way to read, listen, or watch media, and instead explored the idea that audiences use media narratives to fit their own cultural logics, rather than passively receiving the messages that producers intend. The work by these and other earlier ethnographers paved the way for understanding media less as a top-down force and more as a diffuse network of agents that engage with people based on their own life experiences. Rather than searching for narrower, more measurable media influences, cultural researchers began examining how audiences interpret and adopt narratives embedded in media, applying them to activities in their lives. Using sociocultural factors, these scholars have argued that religion, geographic location, socioeconomic status, and gender all influence how audiences engage with media. My findings build on this theoretical framework of audience ethnography to consider how epistemology shapes what audiences come to believe are trustworthy sources of news and information. Ethnography informed another aspect of my methodology: media immersion. From August 2017 to December 2017, I obtained my news exclusively from sources identified by the subjects of the study as trustworthy or accurate. While the list was vast, primary sources drawn on in this book include Fox and Friends, The Daily Wire, The Rubin Report, Prager University, also known as PragerU, The Daily Signal, Red Alert Politics, One American News Network, or OANN, Candace Owens, including her original YouTube channel and her content produced by PragerU, Tucker Carlson, The Drudge Report, Breitbart, Rush Limbaugh, Glenn Beck, and Joe Rogan. In addition to the sources of news I sought out on my own, respondents would also email or share news stories from the Wall Street Journal, Roanoke Times, and the Daily Progress, as well as more obscure websites like wallbuilders.com. By getting my news exclusively from conservative outlets, I identified patterns of information and talking points. I then used these terms, concepts, or general ideas to do more research on the subjects being discussed. When I transferred these concepts into a search query, I was able to understand how certain kinds of truths would emerge within the groups I had been observing, and began to see the ways in which keywords create political silos. I also created a Facebook account specific to this study, which allowed me not only to receive alerts and content created for a very specific audience, but also to document the kinds of news and advertising that Facebook recommended to a profile connected to conservative social groups. I also used Facebook to explore how certain kinds of public spaces were tagged in the communities I was observing. My research was reviewed by an ethical review board, the Chesapeake IRB, prior to collecting data, and all interviewees went through an informed consent process. I would issue friend requests only to those people who had consented, and I never accepted requests from people I had met at public events but who had not provided full informed consent. After the project was over, I closed and permanently deleted the Facebook account to protect the confidentiality of those in my study. Despite IRB review, informed consent, and people knowing I was a researcher, I can only assume that after a few weeks, I became part of their invisible audience, a forgotten follower, a fly on the wall at weekly events. I continually grappled with the ethical questions surrounding this alternative identity, as well as the social media account that accompanied it, which I had created specifically for this project. I was able to access and explore the various cultural experiences I wanted to study because I blended so easily at Bible studies, political rallies, and meetings. This ability to blend in and redraw personal boundaries, however, comes with ethical challenges. I was forthcoming with my role as a researcher and as an academic, but ethnography is about fitting in. To do so, I shifted my public persona to allow the people I spoke with to make their own assumptions about who I was. During the meetings I attended, I spoke quietly, never interrupted anyone, and was careful not to ask too many questions. I often referenced my husband's military background, and sometimes I brought my children with me. In addition to media immersion, I also worked with data scientist Leon Yin, who created a program to scrape metadata that YouTube creators used to amplify their content. Analyzing metadata alongside the content allowed me to identify the key words that political commentators drew on to optimize their content online. Throughout my ethnographic fieldwork and media immersion, I relied on grounded theory to identify relevant academic literature that could help guide my research. During analysis, I used comparative distinctions, coding the data for similarities and differences. After flagging particularly salient in vivo codes, I conducted a more focused coding, determining the accuracy of the identified threads. Using these conceptual categories, I re-examined my field notes and analyzed those findings alongside the media content I was consuming as part of this project. Drawing on interviews, participant observation, and media immersion, I was able to triangulate my data and strengthen the validity of my findings. Media immersion and participant ethnography contextualized how conservatism is both a way of seeing the world and a media practice. After learning about current events from my participants via the news I was consuming or on Facebook, I would search on Google for more information about the topic, using incognito mode to ensure that my existing search history did not influence my results. While this information-seeking process is not perfect and could not control for my geolocation or other personalization mechanisms, my findings exposed a pattern. Time and again, my searches documented the clear role that keywords play in shaping returns and how slight shifts in syntax can return dramatically different, even diametrically opposed results. One afternoon over coffee, a respondent asked me outright whom I had voted for in 2016. I was honest with my answer, Hillary Clinton. He shook his head slowly, looking into his mug. After a few long breaths, he looked back up at me, disappointment in his eyes. "Oh, Franny," he lamented. "They gotcha." For some reason, this struck me. As I drove home that evening, I replayed the conversation repeatedly in my head. He thinks I'm the one who got? To conservatives, I was the cultural dope. When others in this study learned about my voting record, they were equally convinced that once I started doing my own research, I too would see the light. In a certain sense, they were right. Once I began watching, reading, and listening to the news that my conservative respondents cited as trustworthy, it became increasingly difficult to discern the truth. This internal conflict peaked during the Unite the Right rally on August 12, 2017. After observing the rally firsthand, I interviewed respondents who claimed that radical leftists had staged the Unite the Right rally to make Trump look bad, and that George Soros had paid Black Lives Matter protesters to come to town and incite violence. These paired ideas that the mainstream media cannot be trusted and that leftists are violent extremists were so powerful that I started applying them to my own understanding of current events, without even realizing it. For example, in October 2017, when everyone was buzzing about the Mueller investigation and the forthcoming indictment, a thought struck me in the shower late one night. I knew who was going to be indicted. I turned off the water, wrapped myself in a towel, and found my husband. "Do you think it's going to be Hillary?" I asked him. "What?" He was confused. "The indictment. Do you think they're going to indict Hillary?" Then he understood me. But his face took on the same quality as those in this study had when I told them who I had voted for. "No, Francesca, I don't think that's going to happen," he said quietly. and please don't watch Fox News tomorrow. I had been so consumed by a media ecosystem designed to distract from the transgressions of former President Trump and distort the wrongdoings of his political opponents that I legitimately thought Hillary Clinton, the person whom I had voted for in 2016, was going to be charged with breaking the law. But Clinton was not indicted. Despite Trump's call to lock her up, instead, Paul Manafort, Trump's 2016 campaign chairman, was. Manafort was charged with conspiracy against the United States, making false statements, money laundering, and failing to register as a foreign agent for Ukraine, as required by the Foreign Agents Registration Act. This book peels back the layers of the conservative media manipulation machine to reveal why it is so effective at exploiting constituents' worldviews and media practices. These revelations can help all of us be more mindful and savvy about our media consumption. But ultimately, my findings have much broader implications. By offering a more nuanced understanding of the key words and processes that conservative pundits and politicians rely on to amplify, validate, and normalize white supremacist logic, this book offers practical guidance for breaking the disinformation loop. Most efforts reactively target misinformation, but to treat information disorder proactively, we need more ethnographic research on how the ways we use media as individuals and communities are exploited. After finishing this book, some might ask how search engines like Google can fix what has become an increasingly divided internet. But I believe that's the wrong question. What I observed is an ever-evolving socio-technical issue. And to remain obsessed with a fix is to overlook the larger dynamic at play. Conservative elites are leveraging cultural ideologies in order to reframe our understanding of the world around us. Without an ethnographic lens, their tactics remain invisible. Disinformation is not a bug in the code. It's a feature wielded for political gain, and a great risk to American democracy. Prologue. Extremism on Main Street. Saturday, May 13th, 2017. It was a beautiful spring day in Charlottesville, Virginia. The days were growing longer and warmer, but the inevitable humidity and bugs of summer hadn't yet settled in. My partner and I were walking from our home to the Festival of Cultures, an annual gathering celebrating the cultural and linguistic diversity of Charlottesville. Designed with the goal of increasing awareness and bridging communication, the festival offers Charlottesville immigrants a way to showcase the food, art, and music of their countries of origin. At the events I attended, this included Afghanistan, Colombia, Peru, and Ethiopia, in a public park at the center of town. On our way, we passed a flyer inside a 3-hole punched sheep protector that featured a photo of the local statue of Robert E. Lee atop his horse. The statue had been commissioned in 1917 by Paul Goodloe McIntyre and given to the city in 1924 to commemorate the lost cause narrative that Confederates were patriots rising against federal economic tyranny. The statue's unveiling ceremony was used to demarcate white-only spaces during a period of progressive desegregation. Given the statue's history, youth organizers at Charlottesville High School had recently petitioned the city council to remove it, as well as a statue of General Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson, and renamed the parks where the two statues were located. The students' efforts paid off. On February 6, 2017, after initially denying the petition, the City Council narrowly passed a motion to remove both the Lee and Jackson statues from their downtown pedestals, and rename their former homes Emancipation Park and Justice Park, respectively. The flyer we saw read, "Art in Place. Censorship is undemocratic." I was confused for a moment, then recognized the co-optation. Art in Place is a Charlottesville nonprofit that commissions sculptures with municipal funds and installs them around the city to enhance public art appreciation. White supremacists had co-opted their logo in this flyer to associate the Lee statue with the nonprofit and its public works. By doing so, the disinformation suggested that the Lee statue was worthy of protection and that removing the statue was censorship. My partner and I kept walking to the International Festival. Just a few blocks past the flyer, about 100 people crowded around the enormous bronze statue of the Confederate General Stonewall Jackson. Again, I was momentarily confused. I even wondered aloud if they had moved the festival to Jackson Park that year. But as we drew closer to the crowd, it became clear that they were not celebrating Charlottesville's diversity. They were chanting that whiteness was under attack. At the center of this group stood Richard Spencer, white nationalist activist and a future co-organizer of the now infamous Unite the Right rally. In a white button-down, khakis, and aviators, his hair parted and slicked back. He stormed through the park in black boots, wielding a bullhorn and shouting at passers-by. White men in similar outfits and white women in floor-length white linen dresses flanked him, waving large Confederate flags around the Jackson statue. As we passed the event, pushing my young children in a double stroller, they began to chant, "You will not replace us! You will not replace us!" Their shouts echoed against the brick buildings of the town square, the same town square where white people once bought and sold black men, women, and children, and where they used to publicly lynch black men. The afternoon continued, as did the International Festival, and the police presence increased. Uneasy festival vendors decided to put away their tables, tents, and displays early and head home. Later that night, several dozen of the Jackson Park protesters gathered at the Lee statue. They carried cheap, hardware store tiki torches that illuminated pale faces twisted in anger, chanting, "You will not replace us. Jews will not replace us. Russia is our friend," and blood and soil. Signaling camaraderie with Russia was a nod in support of the Trump presidency, and the blood and soil refrain was a reference to the Nazi slogan Blut und Boden, which references a racially ideal body. Calls that whiteness will not be replaced signaled frustration with a supposed white decline, and I'll speak about this later in Step 6. Although they brandished fire in violation of the city's open flame ordinance, chanted Nazi slogans, and failed to obtain a permit for any of the day's or evening's events, no Nazi protesters were arrested. Local law enforcement did not deploy pepper spray, tear gas, or rubber bullets to try to control the crowd. Saturday, July 8, 2017. Soon after May's events, a North Carolina branch of the Ku Klux Klan, or the KKK, the Loyal White Knights, applied for a permit to hold a rally on the steps of the Circuit Court in Charlottesville, Virginia, to protest the removal of the statues. Leading up to the event, local government officials worked with the Charlottesville Police Department and the Klan to agree on a new location, Justice Park, previously known as Jackson Park, the same location where Spencer's May rally had taken place. Residents resisted granting the out-of-state hate group a public demonstration permit to stop cultural genocide, but the city pushed back, claiming that the permit allowed for preparedness in a way that had not been feasible for the previous unpermitted event on May 13, 2017. However, much of the preparedness I witnessed appeared to benefit the KKK. Charlottesville City officials.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?